Changing eye colours is a pretty easy job to go through, and there's a couple of different methods that you can use for it. In fact, it's argued quite a lot out on the message boards about which method is best, so I'll show you two methods which I think work extremely well. First of all, we need to make a selection. We don't have to do anything terribly fancy. I'm just going to use a elliptical marquee tool and make a generally correct, or roughly correct selection around the eye to be changed. And even though it's not terribly accurate, it's alright because we're going to be using some layer masks in this exercise, so we can correct it after we're finished with the eye colour change. Now, the best method. Well, we'll try this method first. Go to the New Adjustment Layer button and place in a solid colour layer. This is the same technique we use for hair colour changes. From the colour picker, just increase the saturation and lightness control so we can actually see the colours. I'll just drag this off to one side a little bit so we can see the eye, and you just simply pick the colour that you're interested in using for the eye. So I'm using a fairly bright blue, and it looks terrible, but don't worry about that. We're going to fix that in a moment, and say OK. Just show the OK there, and done. Now, to get this to work, you need to then change the blending mode for the layer. So go from normal to either overlay, which gives you a very strong mixed version, soft light, which we also use for hair colours because it shows the underlying textures and shadows very well, or colour. Colour will also show you the underlying shadows and textures, but give you a slightly brighter representation of the colour chosen. In fact, that's the closest to the original colour. So I just might stick to colour for this exercise. Alright, now for getting this to look accurate, the opacity needs to be adjusted. It's often far too bright. Now, the opacity can be adjusted in two ways. You can just use the opacity slider on the layer itself, and then just gradually dial in the amount of blue that you want to adjust in. Perfectly reasonable. The other way is to use the colour adjustment layer itself. Just double click on the thumbnail, bring it back into position so we can see what we're doing, and use the brightness slider. It works effectively like an opacity slider, and it's dynamic. You can see it as it happens. As you dial it down, you increase the amount of saturation that's happening for that colour. So either one of those methods is fine. If you don't want to fool around with the layer opacity, you can do it all inside of the colour picker by using the colour and by using the slider at the side to control its saturation. So I'll settle on that, I think. Perfectly reasonable. Okay, cleaning up. Because we've used a layer mask, I'll just show you my layer mask. That's Alt, click on the layer mask thumbnail, or Option click if you're using a Mac. You can see we've got this white circle. I'll just click on the thumbnail. Now that white circle can be adjusted by some simple use of a brush and coloured black and white paint. So I'll take a brush tool, click on the adjustment layer, make sure I'm loaded up with black paint because I'm going to take out this extra little piece of blue that I do not want to have. So I'll just go here and just paint that across. Very simple. It's very flexible when you do it this way because you can manually adjust it quite easily. Now the iris, I'll just adjust this by increasing my brush size. Just reduce that there. I'll just take out the iris so we get that detail back. Now I've also lost a little bit of detail over here, so I need to put that back in, and I do the exact opposite. I just switch to white paint because I'm still working on the adjustment layer mask. I'll just reduce the brush size, and I'm adding in the white to add in to that layer mask. So you can add and subtract using black and white. It's very handy and very easy to do. I'll just back out a little bit so you can judge for yourself. Does it look good? Well, the edges around that mask might be a little bit hard, so what's a good idea for you to consider is to blur it a little bit. Now you can blur it using a Gaussian blur, or you can blur it manually using the blur tool from the toolbox to the side. Either way is perfectly reasonable. I personally prefer to use a Gaussian blur, so I'll use filter blur, Gaussian blur. I'll just bring in the dialog so you can see the Gaussian blur dialog box, and you can see how it will blur the edge immediately. Now just increase it just a little bit. I don't want much blur, just to soften the edge a little bit, and say OK. And that's the colour changed using a colour fill layer. Now I'll turn off this layer and we'll show you the next method, which is to use a hue and saturation layer. Now to save time, I'm going to copy this layer mask with a control click. If you're using the Mac, of course, you're using a command click, and then add a new adjustment layer for hue and saturation. Now when you're using a hue and saturation layer, the only thing you've really got to be aware of is that the colorize box should be turned on, because you need to be able to apply the color exactly. If you just use normal mode, the results are going to be a little bit shaky and difficult to control. So set it to colorize, and then use the hue slider to choose the exact color shade that you want. I'm going for the blues, remember, to enhance the blues. So I'm looking for a blue shade, somewhere around there, and then increase or decrease the saturation according to taste. You can turn on and off the preview so you can see how the effect looks, if it's enough or not. I'll just increase the saturation a little bit more. Yep. And say OK. So there you go. Two different methods for changing the eye colour. That's before, and that's after using a hue saturation layer, and that's before, and that's after using a solid colour layer. Pick the one that spins your wheels.